Hello and welcome to the assignment demo for the beginner drawing course, lesson 1. In this particular demo, I'm going to break down the assignment to make it super easy and clear to understand, as well as show you an actual demonstration of the assignment in action and talk about how you can get the most out of this first week and prime you for the lessons to come. So first of all, the assignment is to take the tools and types of line demonstrated and study any photos, movie stills, masters, or live models you wish. Traditional and digital mediums are both welcome. This course has principles that apply to both, so whether you are going to be working digitally or traditionally, your methods will shift a little bit based on that, but really we're just trying to go for fundamentals here. That's what we're trying to learn and really solidify. So basically we want to talk about just taking these different types of line and using them and seeing how they are used in images so that we can recreate our own images with those types of line and know where to place them. All of the curves, all of the straights, the diagonals, horizontals, verticals, and different types of marks that we're going to be making. I again recommended 1 hour of practice each day, and you can go up to 4 hours per day practicing this with breaks, of course. The object of the exercise is up to you. Again, I know I left a lot of this very open-ended, especially when the course was first released. I know a lot of people want to work on either figures or landscapes or items, and that's why I really made it very open-ended. But the key here is just to use those line types. Just keep focusing on using those line types and constructing with those various lines and getting a feeling of things feeling spatial and dimensional. Now I will show you what all of this means right now. Here I have two examples I pulled from Pinterest. We have a fashion photo and a piece by Mr. Winterhalter, and he was a phenomenal master painter who we're going to study some of his figure drawing work. So we'll start off with Franz, Xavier, Winterhalter here. And let's just talk about the types of lines here before we start even drawing anything. So as you can see, we have a convex line for the forehead. So that's that line that kind of pushes out and rounds like a hill. Then we have the opposite, a concave line. So lines that go like this and lines that go like this are obviously curved lines to some degree or some measure, but we also have to understand that some lines are going to give form in sort of an outward fashion, like a sphere, and some are going to go more inward, like an inverse aspect to the sphere. So we have those two lines right away, right there. Next, you can see this eyelash protruding out. It's basically taking this line right here and just changing its angle a little bit and its inversion. So that eyelash pushes outward, so we have this flow of convex, concave, and then another concave line. You could make the case that it's either convex this way or concave getting sort of sucked in right there, but it really only matters that you recognize the direction. I just use concave and convex as ways to describe whether something is sort of pushing out or sucking in and just kind of inflating or deflating in that regard. Next, we have a very subtle curve for the bridge of the nose. It's not much. It's not straight though. As you can see, when I make this straight line, it's definitely too straight in contrast to this slight curve that we're seeing in this nose from here to here. There's a portion of it that's pretty straight, but then right away we go convex again. So as you can see, we can run the contour of the figure, meaning the outer area of this entire figure here, and try to decide what type of lines to use and where. Those are the tools that I am talking about. It's understanding the contour as well as the stuff inside the figure here too. So things that rest within the contour and the actual contour itself. So as we can sort of demonstrate that with actual drawing as opposed to just breakdowns, that's what I'll be doing next. So first and foremost, when we're starting to draw, this is a really high level to start at. And if you chose a masterwork, just be a little bit forgiving with yourself, because it's going to take a lot of focus and a lot of guessing and checking in order to make sure that things are running properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by recognizing all of the overall outside lines and kind of scanning them, getting a feeling for them in my nervous system. And this way, I'm not actually tracing, but I'm sort of ghosting over. So now that I have an idea in my nervous system of how things are going to go, it'll be easier. That's one way of learning that I hadn't demonstrated when I first released the course, but you can definitely ghost over your reference as a way to understand some of the arcs, some of the straights, some of the curves. We can see that there's a very nice vertical line here that's slightly curved for the neck, and he's bending a lot of these lines just to make sure that you get that very feminine effect, because women tend to have more curves in general than men. And then we want to also talk about some of these bigger shape relationships. Now, shapes are something that we're going to be talking about in week 2, but I'll give you a little preview here. So we have rather large masses that we want to break down, rather big ideas that we can understand by simplifying and again kind of contouring. So this large mass of the hair, you have this smaller area, this smaller shape. So I'm using the tools now to actually trace and to actually create contours that allow me to understand things at yet another level. So we're really just taking these very potent references and breaking them down, just like you could do the same with, say, this sleeve. You can understand that its general shape is pretty much this. And then there's some nuance, there's some curves, some curved lines there, but you have some interesting straights and some interesting curves. So we'll get to that in a second. Basically, now that I have an understanding of some of these larger shapes and their relationships, and I know the contours and the types of lines that I'm going to be using, we can start drawing. Now, there's lots of ways to begin a drawing. When you're first starting out, I recommend just looking at the big shapes and copying them. Don't start very small and try and go out from like an eye or something, because things are going to get disproportionate and difficult very quickly. We want to focus on the big stuff. So we'll start with that curve of the head. Next, we're going to create this overall head shape. It doesn't have to follow the exact profile curvature yet, but we can kind of rough it in. Obviously, when you're going, you want to go slow so that you know when you make a mistake, you can just kind of get rid of it and reset, because all of these marks that I'm making are going to be really imperfect when we're running the contour, which is why we want to have enough patience to only go so fast. So we're just roughing these shapes in here, having that small shape in there, getting caught up in placing some of the facial features. Gonna have to adjust the nose bridge, but there's not a lot to work with at this point. It makes it very easy to keep comparing and contrasting and say, okay, well, that's a little bit misshapen. Let's try that again a little slower. All right, and this is not what we broke down there, so we know that that answer is not quite right. And the element that we're going for is just to learn and to replicate, but not to completely and utterly copy. So now that we have just some sort of semblance, we can begin to proceed a little further, even though there's still inaccuracies to iron out. We're just trying to figure out what types of lines there are here. Oh, how thick are those lines? We talked about lines having various thickness. You can break that down to a pretty thick line. Much like this is a very thin line on the outside of the contour for that delicateness. And you can see that the line is very straight in the nose that I've drawn, meaning I have to curve it just a little bit, just ever so slightly, to make sure that I'm going to be having the desired effect with the type of line that I'm choosing. Because every line ultimately says something. And when we are communicating and learning to communicate as someone who draws, we have to make sure that we're saying the proper thing. You wouldn't use a consonant where there's a vowel. You wouldn't try to put an ingredient in a recipe that may not fit or that would go against the flavor profile of the dish. And so we want to make sure that all of the ingredients that we're putting in, all of the lines that we're putting in, are going to have that harmony. They're going to be cohesive, and you want to spend a good amount of time on the face if you're doing figures. I'll talk more about that later. You can even begin to shade in some of your lines just to make sure that you're separating shapes properly and utilizing just a little bit of line weight or shading. So there is the eyebrow. And I'm going to flip the canvas now just to check for errors, which of course there will be because we haven't flipped yet. So you can see the ear probably starts right there. The eye goes outward. We know that the hair almost crosses with the eyebrow right there. So I can also use lines for measurement. So that's about that far. The eye to the ear is about that far. And then you have the eye to the nostril, let's say. So all of these tools that I'm giving you here are based on line. There's lines for measurement, there's lines for construction and figuring out what the angles of things are, whether they are convex, concave, in their curvature, or if they are more diagonal, maybe more vertical, even horizontal. So just knowing the terminology is huge here. We'll develop more technique as we go, but understanding how to measure and the terminology so that we can name and remember things and use them later as part of our toolbox. We want to have the terminology in our toolbox, because with that terminology we can better express ourselves verbally and linguistically, and we can translate that into drawing. We want to relate things that we understand quite well to things that we are learning, because that cuts our learning curve significantly. And linguistically is one of the fastest ways to do that, next to doing it visually. So as I stated before, there's still plenty to fix on this, and I'm never afraid to erase. I'm never afraid to just keep on adjusting until I have the result I desire. Ideally, it looks pretty close, but it's a little more in alignment with maybe a style that I would like, or the ideas that I like to express. Like maybe a line I would choose to communicate it differently, even though I'm going off of a painting. We're translating it into a drawing and understanding why the artists made the decisions that they did. We're understanding the types of line and practicing using those lines and making sure that we are just getting comfortable in that regard, making sure that we're digging into our toolbox. So there's plenty of that. Now, of course, I didn't start with the biggest shapes, which would be this sort of modified egg and this sort of cylinder here, but we can always key those in later. I'm also not afraid to draw inside of the form so I can understand more of where the skull might kind of end here. And I'm not afraid to correct things as I go. So we have a somewhat vertical line there with just a touch of curvature, as I mentioned before. You have this very interesting shape right here, which we can use that line to sort of denote. Then you have the outward curve into the clavicle, into that collarbone area, and then just a little bit forward. You can tell that's way too convex just by comparing it quickly, but we're just doing this step by step. You know, we're not trying to go too far or too fast or too haphazardly. That makes for more mistakes, which then become difficult to correct in short order. One of the things that I am a big proponent of is making manageable mistakes, because when you make a huge mess, it's way harder to fix it. It's harder to figure out what the priority of the problems are. It's harder to correct the problems even when you can untangle a large mass. So you really have to be conscientious when you're working. You have to make sure that you're being mindful of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what tools you're learning and using in the process. Just extending the head until I find something I like. If I can't get something that I like, I'll go back to measuring, which there's of course no shame in. So let's take the end of the eyebrow here and then take it back using a horizontal line to the back of the head. And you can see the approximate length there. About our halfway point is the ear. So I'm just using this basic measurement tool to figure out what the proportions are going to be, what the relationships of these various marks and lines are going to kind of set as. So from here to right about here. And then I know that's about the line I have to hit to have it feel proportionate. Because I'm not using a guide, I'm always erasing and redrawing until the lines start to fuse in a way that feels right. For example, I use this to denote the shadow underneath the neck, this wonderful little triangle right here, which you can see is curved in a couple different directions. And so that's what I'm going for here. Then we have these very subtle marks that lead up into that ear area. So I'll just move that back a little bit and do a very slight mark, a very light mark. We have to learn how to use lines that are light. So very soft lines like those. And then you have very heavy lines like the kind of lines I'm writing in. So lines that have a lot of heaviness. They have a very heavy impact. This is full opacity, in other words. So you can see there's a great deal of contrast here versus right here. And that's something that I want to be mindful of. I want to know and to translate, what are my light lines? What are my heavy lines? I'm going to put these on another layer so that when I flip, they're not reversed. I want to know what lines are light, what lines are heavy, what lines are curved, what lines are more straight. And all of these different lines and tools are things I can use in my alphabet of art to communicate this figure, to understand this story that is being told before me. And once I can begin to break down that story, I'll understand what makes it tick. I'll understand how I can recreate my own stories using some of these basic elements. And that's what the goal of this course is to teach you the basic elements so that you can create your own stories visually. So that's really what we're aiming to do here. It's not about perfection. It is about understanding the basics. It is about having a toolbox that takes you to a level of creativity and a degree of technical proficiency. It's about giving you a process that you can manage so that you're not overwhelmed and feeling like you're always digging for just to create something that feels all right, just to create something that feels reasonable, and you fail most of the time because you don't have a process. So you can see I'm just really being picky with these lines here. I haven't even moved on to the body really yet because there's so much to learn from the face. And that's okay. We're not in any rush. There's no reason to work any faster than our accuracy will allow us to work. And to decide what type of line here, I'll have to be giving myself enough freedom to remove things I've already done because I know that their relationships change as I erase them. And then I have to find the new relationship, like a very light line to denote the nostril wing right there. And of course, the eye that I have done is a little bit more closed than this very doll-like eye, this very youthful open eye. She looks a little bit older because the lines aren't so light. But I'm just identifying the lines and the shapes. Like I said, we're not going to get too into shapes in this demonstration, but there's ways to get form with just line as well, even though we can often break things down into shapes. So you can tell that as we kind of scale across this skull here, we want a feeling of volume and dimension, which is the feeling of space, that spatial relationship and that form that I talked about earlier. To get form, we have to understand our basic shapes, which again, things like spheres, cones, all that good stuff, we will be talking about in the next lesson. But until we get to that point, it's just wise to think about all these different types of lines and how we're going to use them to break down the things in the assignment. And again, this is a master study I'm doing right now, configuring some of these proportions, understanding what sort of subtleties and lines are at play here. And then there's also a photo study we'll be doing in a little bit here once there has been a sufficient amount of demonstration for this figure. You see, that was like the perfect line. So I just took that little reinforcement right here, which is very small, and then I added just a little bit, and it adds so much with just a really subtle, similar opacity light line to help curve your eye upward back into that ear. And yet you see something right here, which is just sort of a test mark, you know? That mark can go away. We don't need that if we're creating a finished drawing. We're just testing and checking and guessing and correcting. And that's perfectly fine. Like, in order to make this hair separate out, I know I'm going to have to darken this line to make it feel like there's more shadow. So I'll trace the line around a little bit. But I've simplified things to such a degree that I'm losing the feeling of hair, you see, because we have this diagonal that is just clearly immensely diagonal. It's not this subtle interplay that kind of goes on there, which is, of course, immensely soft. And so in order to get the same degree of softness and to break it down in line, I'm going to have to do that again. But because we're being conscientious, we have the time. We have the manageable process that permits us to do that. And so now we have what started as a diagonal line as a guide and then became a much more leveled up line, a more complex relationship of lines that then read a little bit better. It describes the thing we're trying to describe a little bit better. So again, this might seem a little bit advanced, but this is a pretty straightforward breakdown of one method of working, which is very much just looking at the reference, erasing, guessing, checking, comparing, and subtly pulling things out of your toolbox to see how close you can get without going overboard and needing to redo vast portions of it, but just getting closer and closer with these very subtle changes because we didn't have a guide initially. And this is, again, just one process that I wanted to show you, which it's not the absolute best process. It's in terms of getting something very accurate, simply because there's, a lot of measurement to do beforehand, which is all very good. It's really good for breaking it down, but it's not great for exact copies and replication. But that's the point, is we want to learn and we want to break things down. We don't want to duplicate them exactly. Instead, I'll show you another working method on this photo study here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to time lapse things and show you how I lay in the rest of the figure for this particular study, and then we'll move on to this one. All right, so this is the sped up version, wherein I took a 9-minute and 18-second clip and just time lapsed it. And you can see the process is essentially the same, looking at the contour and measuring between the shapes that I've established in order to draw in the shapes that I haven't yet had a chance to establish. So you start off by trying to get your base as accurate as possible, even without guides, which we'll use for the next demonstration. And then you begin to draw out the rest of the forms, trying to feel out which type of line to use, and often curving your lines across the surface so that you can get a feeling of space and dimension and construction. So one thing I do want to point out is you can see all those little dark areas and dark occlusions. Those little triangles or those little shapes, we'll call them enclosures or occlusions for now. That's where you have small shapes that you fill in order to start with line to denote where they go and then finish them off. The rest of this is basically just a matter of looking at the reference and loosely taking down using various types of lines, whether diagonal, horizontal, vertical, or curved, and then shading in some areas just to give it a little more form. but not going crazy with the shading, just trying to understand the lines and the tools that the lines are bringing to the table. Okay, so we'll set these aside for now, and then we'll start on this one. So in this method, we're going to break things down a little bit differently. I'm going to start with lines the same way I would in the other method, but I'm going to look at these shapes and their relationships and use the lines to construct a rough first. So we'll start with the rough, which is stage 1. And we'll just have kind of a simplified head shape there. Then that of course has to have a line to connect it into the neck. So I'll start somewhere in the skull and kind of cruise down into the neck area, which we can see is covered by hair, but we'll approximate the lines that go there. Next, I want to draw on those forms to make sure that I understand the way that they are curving and interacting. The chin protrudes out a little bit more, so we'll just get that in with this version of the drawing. Also the cheekbone as well. We can see that going up a little bit there into the orbicular socket and the brow ridge. Got that same sort of out-in-out relationship, which we will talk a lot about throughout demonstrations and the course. Then we have, of course, the little window where the eyes are going to go. We can start with a line to kind of get the forms right in that capacity. Same with a line for the nose and then another line for the mouth. We just want their approximate spatial relationship, just sort of the proportions where they're going to land. Then from the eye, this one maybe right here, we can find our ear. So we'll just use a shape for that. And it's okay if this doesn't really match up quite yet. Again, we're just trying to rough things in with our grid. Next, we can see the shoulder girdle, which is somewhat of a trapezoid, maybe a triangle. So we'll just use these two lines, which are diagonal in nature, to get that laid in. Next, I want to curve around for the shoulder. As you can see, that curvature is pretty apparent right here. And we're then going to do the same thing with the curvature of the shirt. So lastly, we'll curve around for the shoulder and kind of use a diagonal line to go back in there. Then we'll come outward for the bust. We'll use that to approximate where the other part of the bust will be. And then we'll take this very clear diagonal line and just find where that's going to rest in proportion to where we did this shoulder curve here. So a little bit of a distance from here to here, kind of finish off the shoulder curve a little, but then we'll use that line to go diagonal downward. And that makes it hard to see our form here, so I'm going to get rid of my measuring tool there and instead go for another form line, which again is curved. Then we have to figure out where the arm is going to be placed. We can start by marking it out here and just sort of taking another diagonal line, diagonal-ish line outward in that direction, and then shooting another one downward. And we'll know if we get it right by the triangle we form in the negative space here. So let's just do that quickly and guess and check our shapes a little bit. Almost there. And pop that up a little bit diagonally. All right, let's just finish off where the shirt's going to end pretty roughly here. And where we go into the navel as well as the belt, which we want to make sure we get wrapping around the form. So just run a couple curved lines in that direction. I overshot this one and then kind of came over and corrected based on where I would like to stop. Again, this is just the rough we're laying in. You see how it comes in to play a lot quicker than the other method, which is what most people often start off with intuitively when they start drawing. They don't use a lot of guides. They just look at their reference and go, which is fine. And you can develop your own techniques based on that and your own measurements. But we also want to know different modalities of working in case one resonates for a purpose that the other does not. So now I'm just going in and talking about those little triangular enclosures that we had before. In this case, they're not as triangular, but we know we're going to shade those in later, so I'll mark that down. And you can see there's lots of overlap, lots I'm not really correcting as of yet because I want to see the shape relationships. I want to see how they're coming together. And I'm using these curved lines, some of these more straight diagonal lines to kind of stylize and figure out this pose here. So now we have this hand shape, which I'll start with two diagonals. I know I'm going to get a little triangle right here because that's what I'm seeing. So we'll take that and just make a quick thumb, push down into the two fingers that are visible, and maybe just do some form lines around there to help us recognize the dimensionality that exists. Kind of fill out some of these other lines. And then we can't even see the other arm. There's just this little tiny triangle that lets us know that it exists back there in probably a similar position to this one. So then we'll just have that gamut of buttons, just little circular shapes that go down. And of course, it's just a skirt. So we actually shot the hand in a little close here so that it's overlapping, which is fine because we're working digitally. We'll just pull that back a bit. For the guide, you can see it would make for kind of an unbelievable butt if we kept that line out there. So we'll just get rid of that and then follow the contour down this way. And this is more of a straight. This is a great example of a pretty close to a straight diagonal with a curve on the other side. And you have sort of that inward curve, outward curve rhythm we talked about with a small diagonal, another approximate diagonal with another outward curve. So you're starting to see the pattern here, hopefully, in terms of the contour and in terms of some of the interior as well, so that you can see that this is obviously very spherical. It's very easy to see based on the pattern of the shirt. So you know that the bust is relatively spherical based on the distortions happening here in the shirt. And we're always looking for volume and form and dimension, even though we're working linearly, thinking predominantly inline. But now that we have our base roughed out, I'm going to just go over it with more certain lines after lowering the opacity, because again, we're working digital. If I were doing this in my sketchbook, I would just erase the first drawing until it was really light like this. Then I would go over it again with more assured lines, which is what we're going to be doing now. And we're going to be laying in some facial features and making it look a little bit more presentable as a drawing. Although if you wanted to spend time just doing these, that is completely and totally a really good idea, honestly, because you're going to have an easier time breaking stuff down if you keep doing just this method. But for the sake of those of you who want a little more cleanliness, we'll go for that as well. First, I'm going to flip the canvas so I can get fresh eyes on this. You're seeing me do this without going into the menu, which is image, rotation, flip canvas horizontal, and that's because I have it hotkeyed to Command H. So next, we're going to start off with the head first. You can see there's a lot of interesting shapes going on here. I'm just going to simplify all that because I want this to be a very stylized drawing that just considers shapes in their larger formats. We're not going to go as crazy with nuance and detail as we did with the other drawing. We're going to keep this one very constructive. So there's that same relationship of the out in out, convex, concave kind of dance that we see so often in figures, especially female figures. And we have that chin line, which of course I'm going to just knock back a little bit with the eraser. Just make it a little more subtle because it's very straight there. Then we have the approximate placement of the lips. I'll start with the two dots, turn that into a line between those dots, kind of like we did with the shoulder to elbow to wrist connection. And then I'll draw some lips around those lines. And you can just shade in your enclosures if you want. It's a little too distinct, a little bit stank face there. So we're going to try that one more time. Just a little subtler. You see how sometimes it takes a couple goes, but that one is much better, so we'll stick with that. Next, we have the nostril. We got that piercing that goes across the nostrils. And then just that subtle line on the other side, which I'm going to flip and check because we're working on the face right now and you can't be too careful. So this is one big shape. It's merging a little too much. I will be more meticulous with the face. You can't really even see the other nostril. So we'll just start with those two indications of a nostril using these weighted lines, which are practically transforming into shapes. So again, we're going to get into that in the next lesson, but you'll naturally gravitate towards that. Not every one of your lines is going to be linear and straight and very perfect. You'll start to understand this very subtle nuance that happens as you're drawing, as you're laying out these tools of horizontals and verticals and light lines and dark lines, that they're ultimately wanting to become shapes. But we need to understand their rudimentary forms as well so that we can work with those shapes. It's really difficult to do this particular part because I'm not working with a ton of resolution. I would have to zoom in a little bit, which if you're having trouble, I do recommend, so that you can have a little more detail orientation in your work. So with that, it's a little bit better, a little bit closer. I'm not going for exact likeness again. This isn't a commission, this is a demonstration. This isn't a finished piece, this is for learning purposes. So you have this interesting curvature going on in these areas, which is going to take a little bit to capture properly. There's a lot of time you want to spend on the eyes. Just shade them in so I can see the shape that I'm working with, not just the line. All right, then we have eyebrows, which in this case are fairly strong. You can see that I did this really quickly and it didn't work very well. So we're going to try that again, except we're going to measure a little better this time. That one's a little cleaner. And then this one goes off the side of the face a little bit. Now we got to add a little more detail and efficacy to those eyes, because even though this is very stylized, we want to make sure that we have an appealing face, because if we're doing figure work, unless we're super focused on the body, we still want to have a face that you can look at and connect with. So it's got to be appealing enough with enough detail and enough consideration and conscientiousness. So there's that portion. I'll shade some of that mascara in. Yeah, so these eyes are all right. I'm not super happy with them, so I'm going to do them one more time. And this time I'm going to reference a little looser, because these are really intriguing shapes based on the lens that was used for the camera, and they honestly look a little disproportionate because of how long this is versus how short this is. And it's almost like I'd rather have my own proportions in this case, which is something that if you feel called to do, you can definitely fix, quote unquote, what you're looking at, because you should never be 100% beholden to your reference in most cases. So I'm going to look at them roughly and decide for myself which shapes and lines are going to work better in this instance. Just keeping in mind the different lines that are at my disposal, and keeping things nice and simple so that everything that I add, I know what I've added or subtracted that works or doesn't work. Like those two didn't work, so we'll just push that back. And then that is looking better. Not quite proportionate. As you can see, this one's a little bit high. and that's what I can use the reference for, is to reconfigure some of their relationship. So then we have the nose bridge, which I'm going to knock back to a little more subtlety. And then we can just start to scan around some of the eyelids to add thickness to the lines and create a little more pop and contrast. Quick eyebrow shading, nothing too fancy. We're going to keep adjusting the nose until we get that right too. All right, subtle little wingtip there. Actually, this is the wingtip. What I meant is the wing of the nostril. So then I'll just put a little mark there to show that this is a surface plane of the nose bridge that'll go all the way up this way. You can kind of see it in this highlight and that triangular shape that occurs in the nose bridge. Still want to keep the makeup fairly heavy like it is in the reference. Got to contain the shading with a shape, otherwise it just looks like they're a sort of a mishap. So I'm going to strengthen this a little bit. It's a little small in contrast. And now we're getting somewhere. All right, since I already broke down the neck, it's going to be fairly easy to draw. You notice how we had that strong triangle in the previous drawing, but in this one it's a very subtle, just sort of shaded, soft edge underneath. So I won't bother to go too much into detail with that because there's more important stuff to worry about. I have a line that I made to showcase where the hair was going to go. You can just substitute that with some triangles. It's that additive, subtractive drawing process. This is obviously very stylized, that initial shape and line lay-in. So I can just do something similar with that. And there's just a bit of hair convexly pushing out from this shape right here. So we'll run with that just a tad because it really does add a very nice subtlety, which is one great thing to learn from the reference. I'll always remember that as I'm drawing similar poses and such in the future. There's some very simple lines we've shaded in. So already you can see the process of breaking stuff like this down and studying is really helpful, because in later weeks we're going to start drawing from our imagination, and we want to recall the things that we're learning in these earlier lessons. We really want to take a fair amount of information with us, because that's the kind of stuff that builds up your visual library and allows you to make alterations and changes that end up looking appealing and believable. Keeping it simple. You have the lay-in line and then just a couple little stray strands. I'll break up the shape a little bit, otherwise it looks completely solid, which is something that's nice when you're constructing the figure. Like I talked about construction in this lesson, that's what we're doing in the first phase of this. But now it's a little bit more advantageous to pay attention to certain subtleties that are going to humanize it, soften it, and add a little more appeal. And as you work your way through this course, I'll talk more about some of the specifics, give you more terminology to work with. But for now, it's just a matter of capturing these curved lines, capturing the more straight lines, and moving forward. break up some of that because it looks very solid. It's a very strong line. And then we will imagine the top of the head because it's not there. So I zoomed in a little bit close. I want to zoom out a little now so that I can see what I'm doing and how it affects the whole. Like, this is a really strong line that I used to just lay in where the bangs were going to go, but I don't really need it anymore because the bangs have been established. The rest of this is just about overshooting just enough so that it looks like the hair is wrapped around the head and not completely like a weird helmet attached to it. There's a lot of subtleties going on here with the way that I'm drawing and erasing these lines, and we'll get into techniques like that later. But it always helps to have an appealing drawing and to go slowly. So at this point, now that I have a head that I'm pretty satisfied with, it's just a matter of working on the body next. So we'll just stylize a little bit to help denote the cheeks and the structure of the face a little bit, because you see there's a pretty big highlight there, so I'll just make a little circle there and a circle there to show off the highlight. And then I'm going to shade the lower lip a bit more underneath. All right, so now we're going to take some of these lines and follow them, lines we've already established. So there's that one. It's a little risque, so we're not going to go crazy with that. It's just something to learn from. So we'll flip to check our progress. This floats a little weird in my vision, so I'm just going to get rid of it. It's a very intuitive thing. I think it was just a little too close, and I didn't extend the eyelashes enough, so it started to read like eyelashes. And if your eyes are getting confused in an area, it's likely that when somebody looks at your work, then the eyes are, or not the eyes, but their eyes will be confused as well. See, what I can do here, because it's really subtle, is I should probably have it hanging down lower and keeping the subtlety in that other nostril, so I can bring it down even farther and make sure I don't shade it in so it doesn't look like one big shape. It has a bit of contrast. And that's looking better. Just keep some subtle shading atop it though, just to pop it a little bit more. Again, you see the subtlety at work here. There's not a lot of big movements. It's all very wrist-based. Some of these bigger ones will for sure be more elbow or shoulder based in my motion, kind of like I talked about in week 0. So that's a little too deep. It's a little closer. We can work with that and curve that around, push it out a little bit, just like we did before in our guide. A nice little triangle there. And we have the convex shape, which of course leads us back here. And you see I'm just sort of flowing in and out of different spots. Again, using what I've established to help to configure what I have not yet established. Now that I've turned the canvas, this looks a little bit deep. So I'm being very picky about that line because it's going to tell a story of form and how the top overlaps on her upper body. Got some very subtle lines here for collarbones, which can help to showcase, again, more form. Good chance to use some very light lines as opposed to very heavy ones. And we have this little part where the shirt turns over the form of the neck, which will just use a little bit of shading there to showcase. Then go back up into the neck. And to separate the hair from the neck, I've got to use yet a little more shading. You seem to be running over the line a few times. Just like I can showcase the spherical nature of the skull by getting the hair to pop a little bit, running some more convex lines throughout there. It's like I almost want to see a way to break the silhouette a little bit out here, just because it's not quite enough to give me the head shape I'm looking for, the way that the hair's draping on it. One thing you can also do to check your work is to rotate the canvas. I like to rotate 90 degrees, see how my shapes are holding up that way. Maybe go 45-ish or 30 or 15, just holding shift and using R to rotate. It's pretty ubiquitous in most digital art programs. So all I need for this part to showcase the other breast is that light convex line, because that's kind of what I'm seeing here as my eye tries to find out how the form is turning there. We have this pretty notable bump because of the curvature of the arm coming out and how that causes the shirt to react. So we'll just have another curve that way, and you can see there's tons of value chains down here. It gets very dark very quickly, and it just shoots out into all of those wrinkles and folds. So that's quite a intimidating shape. So what we'll do is we'll just stick with the triangle we know. It's that nice little triangle, and shade that baby in. That's way simpler and gets the same idea across for now, whereas we'll talk more about cloth in later lessons, but it just sort of pushes out and helps you discern the form and where some of that's going to go. So we won't get too intimate with it right now. We're just trying to use these line types, and those are pretty solid, looking fairly nice, so we'll stick with that. This is a little overshot because that upper arm is looking a little bit long in the guide in contrast to this one. Just by measuring, so say we start right about here, which would have some hair overlap. I didn't bother to do because it's more about the shapes than all of the hair. So probably about this far is about as far as I want to take it. Then we have just a bit of a diagonal curve there, and then we'll curve back in, follow suit over here, try to get a nice quick line with my elbow going outward that way, and then follow suit, keeping in mind the taper of the wrist. Rotate to double check, looking solid. At this point, you pretty much understand the types of line and how to use them to break down things that you're studying, and how not to rush, but be willing to correct mistakes. We have a whole chapter on that later. And to take into account whatever it is you want to study or that you're inspired by, and to use these lines to break it down. The curves, the more vertical ones, the more horizontal ones, and of course the diagonals. So I think this is a good stopping point for the demonstration. I want to thank you for your patience and attention. If anything is unclear to you at this point, I suggest you reread each little chapter, each little paragraph, which would help if it wasn't flipped around, and just really absorb this text. I know it's a lot to start off with, but with this assignment, things have been exposed a little bit more. We've talked about our different line types. We've talked about processes we can use to study and what fundamentals we're really thinking of in terms of the contour, in terms of shape relationships, in terms of measuring. And this is a fair amount for the first lesson, but this is sort of the gauntlet. If you can make it through this lesson, then the rest of the course will have a much more synchronistic progression. You won't have as much to handle all at once, but there are some really important fundamental ideas to begin drawing with. And that's what I wanted to convey to you in this particular assignment demonstration. So think of your line types, think of your processes, think of having a feeling of space and constructing things in a way that is very measured and very conscientious so that you can go back and handle mistakes as they will inevitably arise. And with that, I will wish you happy drawing, and I will see you in the next lesson.